Let's set the stage. It's 1988, and the Pixies are dealing with a problem they didn't expect. People won't stop talking about them. Surfer Rosa hadn't charted, barely sold at all in the conventional sense, but it detonated throughout the underground, and suddenly the momentum was real. Black Francis spent the tour riding on the road, demoing ideas wherever the schedule allowed. They walked into the studio with a $40,000 budget, modest but 4 times what they'd had for Surfer Rosa. Producer Gil Norton spent 2 full days analyzing the demos before anyone touched an instrument. His mandate? Take the violent, lurching, quiet, loud dynamic the Pixies had stumbled onto and give it shape without killing it. What came out was sharper, cleaner, and somehow even more ferocious. But the fault lines forming within the band in that studio would widen for the next 5 years until the band was gone. This is Doolittle. Welcome to Album Archives, the vault of music history, where we dive into the top 300 albums of all time as voted on by fans of the Music Rewind podcast. I'm your host, Steve Epley, and today we're cracking open number 251, Doolittle by Pixies. Released April 17, 1989 on 4AD, this 40-minute second album is the record that solidified the quiet, loud dynamic that defined alternative rock in the 90s. It influenced everyone from Nirvana to Radiohead to Smashing Pumpkins, and somehow still sounds like nothing else. The classic lineup of Black Francis on vocals and rhythm guitar, Joey Santiago on lead, Kim Deal on bass and vocals, and Dave Levering on drums. Brace yourself, turn it up, and let's dive into the chaotic world of Pixies. Pixies came together in Boston in 1986 when Charles Thompson placed an ad in the Boston Phoenix looking for a bassist who liked both Husker Du and Peter, Paul, and Mary. A combination specific enough that only one person answered. That was Kim Deal, who didn't actually play bass. Her main instrument was guitar, but she borrowed her sister's and showed up anyway. She recommended her friend's husband, Dave Levering, as drummer, and the lineup was complete. By 1988, they'd released Come On Pilgrim, an 8-track EP that put the underground on notice. And then came Surfer Rosa, their Steve Albini-produced debut. Raw, confrontational, and deeply strange. The UK press loved it, but American mainstream radio didn't really know what to do with it, and the word was spreading fast. The question now is whether they could build on it without sanding off the edges. Gil Norton was brought in to produce, and his mandate was essentially keep the chaos, but add the clarity. They recorded at Downtown Records in Boston starting on Halloween 1988, then finished at Carriage House Studios in Connecticut. Norton pushed them toward a cleaner sound, insisted Kim Deal use a vintage 1962 Fender Precision bass, and helped Francis refine song structures that were already dense with ideas. All on that $40,000 budget that was 4 times what they'd spent on Surfer Rosa, but a fraction of what major labels were spending on others. They also finished in just 6 weeks. The album opens with Debaser, inspired by the 1929 surrealist film Un Chien Andalou by Luis Buñuel and Salvador Dali. Specifically the scene where an eyeball is sliced open, and I apologize if I butchered any pronunciations there. Francis said he watched the film twice, decided he didn't entirely understand it, and wrote the song anyway. And that is the perfect summary of this album's creative logic. Tame follows immediately, the quiet, loud dynamic arriving fully formed. Deal's bass groove in a whisper, then Francis exploding into something that sounds genuinely unhinged. Wave of Mutilation is the story of a Japanese businessman driving his car into the ocean with his family in the back seat. I Bleed is PJ Harvey's favorite Pixies song. She called it beautifully structured, haunting, scary, and moving.
As loud as hell, ringing bell. Behind my smile, it shakes my teeth, and all the while, vampires feed.
And then here comes your man. Impossibly bright, almost Beatles-esque, completely at odds with everything around it, and one of the purest pop songs the band ever wrote. The contrast isn't accidental, it's the whole point.
Outside there's a boxcar waiting, outside the family store.
Monkey Gone to Heaven became the first Pixies song to feature outside musicians, 4 string players adding a chamber element to what is essentially a song about God, garbage, and environmental collapse. David Bowie called the Pixies the most compelling music he's heard outside of Sonic Youth. The album peaked at number 8 in the UK, sold 100,000 copies in America in its first 6 months, pretty solid for an indie record. It made almost no impact on the mainstream Billboard chart. None of that mattered. The album does get a little darker. Dead tells the story of Uriah the Hittite from the Old Testament, a man sent to die in battle so King David could take his wife. Hey is built on one of Deal's most absurd bass lines and a Santiago guitar solo that sounds like someone's reaching for something just out of range. La La Love You is Dave Lovering's showcase, a goofy, sweet vocal turn that functions as a palate cleanser between the heavier material. And Gouge Away. It closes the whole thing on a biblical eruption. Francis screaming about Samson and Delilah with a full chest. It's 15 tracks, 40 minutes, zero compromise. David Bowie called the Pixies the most compelling music he'd ever heard outside of Sonic Youth. The album peaked at number 8 in the UK, sold 100,000 copies in its first 6 months in America, solid for an indie record, but made almost no impact on the mainstream Billboard chart. But in reality, none of that mattered. Thematically, Doolittle lives at the intersection of surrealism, scripture, and chaos theory. Francis said he got into avant-garde films as an escape from reality. He wrote the way David Lynch described making films, whose meaning even the creator didn't entirely know. The result is an album that rewards deep listening while rewarding surface listening equally. You can hear it as great guitar rock or as a fever dream, and both interpretations are correct.
What's that floating in the water? Oh, Neptune's only daughter. I believe in Mr. Greaves, that old man in the middle, one that talks like Doolittle. I believe in Mr. Greaves.
Let's put 1989 in context. Hair metal was still filling arenas, grunge hadn't broken through yet, alternative music lived in college radio, independent labels, and a handful of record stores. Doolittle was released on 4AD, a British independent, to a bidding war from American majors that eventually landed them an Elektra deal for US distribution. Melody Maker and Sounds both named it the album of the year. Rolling Stone gave it 5 stars and said it laid the groundwork for all 90s rock. At the time, almost nobody in America was paying attention. 3 years later, Nevermind dropped, and everyone went back to find the blueprint.
There was a guy an underwater guy who controlled the sea.
Why does Doolittle endure? Because it solved a problem nobody knew music had. How do you be aggressive and melodic at the same time? How do you be weird and accessible? How do you write about eyeball slicing and Japanese businessmen and have it sound like the most natural thing in the world? Black Francis figured that out, and every alternative band for the next 30 years learned from him, whether they knew it or not. The legacy carries real shadow. After Doolittle, the tensions between Francis and Deal began escalating. He threw a guitar at her at a show in Germany, nearly fired her, and by 1993 had dissolved the band entirely without telling the other members, announcing it on a BBC radio interview as if it were a casual aside. Deal found out with everyone else. She didn't sit still, though. Deal had already co-founded the Breeders in 1989, initially as a side project with Tanya Donnelly of Throwing Muses. And when Pixies imploded, the Breeders became her full focus. Their 1993 album Last Splash went platinum, spawned the alt-rock staple Cannonball, and proved that Deal wasn't just the bassist in someone else's band. She was a songwriter, a band leader, and a voice entirely her own. Pixies' loss was the Breeders' gain.
If you go, I will surely die. But you ain't. But you ain't. But you ain't.
They reunited in 2004, toured Doolittle track for track on its 20th anniversary, and eventually Deal left again in 2013 to return to the Breeders. The band continues now with a different bassist. The classic lineup, the one that made this record, has never fully reassembled. But the album itself is permanent. It's on every meaningful best-of list. It gave a generation of musicians permission to be strange and melodic simultaneously. And somewhere in the opening seconds of Smells Like Teen Spirit, you can still hear it. I'll be honest, I came into Album Archives barely knowing a thing about the Pixies. They were the band that Kurt Cobain was trying to copy, and they had that song in Fight Club. That was the full extent of my knowledge. But somewhere between Surfer Rosa and Doolittle, something has clicked. I get it now. I finally understand what my music nerd friends have been saying for years. I may be late to the game on Pixies, but I'm glad I showed up. If you haven't heard Doolittle front to back, and I mean really heard it, not just Here Comes Your Man, do it tonight. New to the Pixies, you can start here. It can be considered the most complete version of what they were fully capable of. Longtime fan, you already know every word. Either way, turn it up until the neighbors call the cops. And for those building the collection, there's a link in the show notes for that vinyl. That's it for this edition of Album Archives, the vault of music history. If you enjoyed it, please share it with a friend or leave a review wherever you listen. Next up is number 250. Everybody else is doing it, so why can't we? By the Cranberries. Check out musicrewindpodcast.com/albumarchives to see where we're at and where we're headed. If there's an album that shaped your life and didn't make it into the top 300, you can now dedicate an episode of Album Archives to it. Every album has a story, and this is how you can tell yours. Link in the show notes. For now, I'm Steve Epley, and as I always say, listen to the full album. Until next time.
A podcast from the Sidereal Media Group. Back to you, anchors.